Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon in Scotland and the rest of the UK, and welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Perbrick. I'll moderate the discussion today and give our introduction. With us is Roddy Gow, the chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute. Also Rick Minchon, who's our head of development. Several of us in Scotland, several overseas, and we have quite a spread of people today. And our focus for the discussion is the future of terrorism. Quite a broad title for a complex, a surprisingly complex, I think, topic that that can still arouse a great deal of controversy. But we have a panel of people who I think can cut through controversy and give a great deal of insight into the issue. From the Handa Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence from the University of St Andrews. It's a centre that I'm glad to say I know very well. And can testify to its strengths. It's founded in 1994, and it's certainly Europe's oldest centre for the study of terrorism. And I think it's fair to say one of, or the leading centre in the world for the study of terrorism. And that's a great credit to Scotland and Scottish universities, obviously. I'd just like to mention the founder of the centre, the late Paul Wilkinson, who's credited as one of the creators, I think, of the study of terrorism as an academic field. And his book, Terrorism versus Democracy, which I have and I've read several times, remains one of the most important texts in that study. And I'm sure our panelists know Paul Wilkinson well and his work. So our panelists are equally well prepared to talk about the subject, I think. Dr. Tim Wilson, Centre Director since 2016. Comments widely, obviously, on the past, present and future of terrorism and political violence. And I think we'll say something about the differences shortly. His most recent book is Killing Strangers, How Political Violence Became Modern, which appeared with Oxford University Press in 2020 and examines how contemporary violence has come to take the disturbing and impersonal forms that it does. Coming to us from across the pond, Noah Tucker, as he puts it himself, an American washed up on the shores of Scotland. But we're very grateful that you're glad you're here, Noah. A visiting scholar at the Handa Centre, Programme Associate at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, Central Asia Programme, and a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Centre. Noah has worked on multiple projects identifying the way social and religious groups affect political and security outcomes in Central Asia and Afghanistan. Obviously has a strong focus on that area, geographical area, and spent 6 years living and working in the region. And I think we particularly want to hear Noah's views on what's the likely outcome of the situation in Afghanistan the next few years. Lastly, Dr. Zhang Ci is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of St Andrews, has taught at the University of Leeds, Royal Holloway University of London and University of Liverpool. Her postdoctoral project examines challenges and conditions for counter-terrorism cooperation with China. I think I'd stress this is probably one of the most important areas of the study of terrorism at the moment and in the future because of the importance of China and the rise of China and the problems in Central Asia and the borders with China. So we're particularly grateful for Dr. Zhang for being on this panel today as well. So just for logistics, if I could remind everyone, we're on the Zoom webinar platform. Your videos and microphones can't be displayed and only the panelists can be seen and heard. But we do want to hear from you. So please raise your questions in the Zoom chat function and we'll get through to as many of them as we can. Obviously, if you can put them as a question, that's easier to address them rather than just comments. So a question with a question mark would be nice. And I'd just like to open, before I hand over to Tim, with a couple of quotes that I think show how complex the issue of terrorism is. Firstly, from Osama bin Laden in 1996. And this is a little longer quote, but please excuse me if I take a minute for this. And I quote, "As for the accusations of terrorizing the innocent, the children and the women, these are in the category of accusing others with their own affliction in order to fool the masses. The evidence overwhelmingly shows America and Israel killing the weaker men, women and children in the Muslim world and elsewhere. A few examples of this are seen in the recent Qana massacre in Lebanon, and the death of more than 600,000 Iraqi children because of the shortage of food and medicine, which resulted from the boycotts and sanctions against the Muslim Iraqi people, and the withholding of arms from the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina, leaving them prey to Christian Serbians who massacred and raped in a manner not seen in contemporary history. Quite a nuanced interpretation of events, obviously. But then I'd switch over to George W. Bush in his speech to Congress, I think, after the 9/11 attack. And I quote, "On September the 11th, the enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country." And then he went on later in the speech, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." Again, somewhat nuanced, and in hindsight, it's proved highly controversial what a war on terrorism means. And lastly, I'd just like to give a very brief quote from Salman Rushdie. And I quote, "How to defeat terrorism? Don't be terrorized. Don't let fear rule your life, even if you are scared." And on that note, trying to set the scene, Tim, you have the most difficult part, I think, to introduce the centre and your views on terrorism. I'd be very grateful if you can talk to us about what you think has happened in the past several decades, and most importantly, what you think is going to happen in the future.
Thanks very much, Martin. Thanks, Martin and Roddy, for this very kind invitation to talk to the Asia Scotland Institute. And thank you for the very generous words about the inelegantly named, but in terms of terrorism studies centres, quite venerable now, Handa Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. And I will perhaps, since Martin has cued me in there, say perhaps a little bit of an aside on the difference between political violence and terrorism. I often think of it as a little bit like the scene in the Blues Brothers, where the Blues Brothers turn up to that roadside bar and try and work out where they are, and have a discreet word with the waitress about what they can get away with playing. And she says, "Oh, don't worry, sir, you know, at this bar we do both types of music. We do country and Western. We do political violence and terrorism." But there are, you know, these phenomena often overlap, but they can also, I think, be usefully disaggregated. And that's a theme I will perhaps touch on in a moment. I must confess to some slight apprehension to living up to the billing on, I think, 3 counts, really. One, I'm not an expert on Asia, but I'm glad that Chi and Noah are here to help me out and save the centre's reputation on that score. Perhaps more specifically, I've been invited to speak on the future of terrorism. If there's one thing that you can be guaranteed, it's an invitation to speak about the future, is an invitation to be publicly and spectacularly wrong. None of us ever quite get it right, and it's perhaps something that universities and academics generally don't always admit to, is how rarely we see the future coming, the end of the Cold War, or whatever it is. And specifically in the study of terrorism, I mean, it's really a field which has been littered with moments of overwhelming common sense that turned out to be entirely mistaken. So, you know, the early 1990s was a moment when, rather famously, for those who study terrorism at least, terrorism was really seen as kind of yesterday's problem. It was seen as a symptom of the Cold War. It was seen as something that really had been sponsored or induced by the Soviet Union in myriad ways, and that really was going to fade and wasn't going to be the shape of the future at all. Part of the reason, actually, that CSTPV was founded when it was founded way back in 1994 was because Paul Wilkinson had the good sense to invite Bruce Hoffman over from America, where Bruce, who was an up-and-coming terrorism expert, really was finding it hard to get funded at the Rand Corporation because terrorism is yesterday's problem. Of course, you know, Paul Wilkinson and Bruce Hoffman were much more far-sighted than many, but it's worth remembering that. It's worth remembering in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the kind of common sense was, with this horrific mass death toll, that terrorists were clearly seeking more and more mass casualty, larger atrocities, and that the obvious turn then was to the so-called WMD, weapons of mass destruction path of chemical or biological or radiological weapons, which you know, there's some evidence they experimented with, but actually the shape of the future was different. And the recent years, there's been a really quite striking preponderance of really quite low tech, scattered and amateur spontaneous attacks. So, you know, we don't always get it right about the future, but thank you for your trust in me to, I hope, be at least interestingly wrong. So if I can lower expectations right at the start, that's probably the best way to go. Now, that my second sort of point of concern is perhaps a little bit more surprising for a someone who has the honor to be the director of a terrorism studies center that is, your very kind words, Martin, notwithstanding, I think it is fair to say, relatively well known. And that is the word terrorism itself, which is perhaps a surprising thing for me to question with my job title. But as our students well know, lesson one, day one is to be hit with the dreaded "what is terrorism" question, which is a kind of innocent-looking three-worder that sort of tends to lead to a lot of head scratching and long nights in the library for good reasons. Now, I think there are, it is fair to say, actually some very good pieces of academic work that have taken together, sort of sketched an outline of terrorism as a distinctive form of political violence. So here I'm now in my Blues Brothers, terrorism versus political violence. Political violence is really a very broad category. It just means, use of physical harm really to advance some sort of political agenda, and could be governments doing it, or it could be much more spontaneous and disorganized as riots and so on and so forth. The thing that tends to be seen as distinctive about terrorism is a sort of quality of triangulation or indirect signaling, we can say. So very typically, some actor A does something against group B, often just civilians going to work on the London Underground or whatever it is. But the real point is to send a message to another audience C, usually a state or a government. So in some ways, it's a strangely indirect form of political violence. It's often about not hitting the ultimate target. It's about using, in a kind of horribly cynical, instrumental, impersonal way, a group of victims to broadcast a message more widely. And, I do think, that's quite a helpful way of looking at things, actually. I mean, one can always argue over the boundaries of these phenomena. That's what people like I get paid to do. But, I think that is quite useful. The real world problem is that, however clear it looks in the seminar room or the library, this isn't a term that we academics and scholars control, and that may be a good thing, but it's also a term being used in coffee shops, in high streets, on the top of tabloid newspapers, on social media, and in the corridors of power, and it's going inevitably to be contested. It's a very strong pejorative term, of course, carries a very negative charge. In the English-speaking world, I think it's fair to say it's often been seen as a sort of imported phenomenon. I mean, especially in the US, I think, particularly with the experience of 9/11, often the default reaction of those who analyze it, from government or policy or the academic world, has been to see it, particularly Islamist terrorism, because the two often get conflated, as a sort of foreign policy issue, as something that came and attacked America in 2001. But I mean, this isn't just America. There's a reason why CSWV is in the School of International Relations at St. Andrews rather than the School of History or other places it might be. So there is often this sense, I think, from various, from the Anglosphere, from Western English-speaking countries, that terrorism is somehow a sort of external problem, or at least that's how we used to see it, because if we learned anything in the last 20 years, it's that the world is interconnected. I mean, I reveal that banal insight with no great expectation. It's shocking to you, but that surely is one of the lessons of the last 20 years of this extraordinary episode that, Martin, you were powerfully quoted George W. Bush, declaring his war on terror, extraordinarily open-ended declaration. And many have argued an extraordinarily futile declaration that had about as much chance of success as Mao Zedong's war on sparrows. In other words, not very much in the long term. But this sense that one could banish a form of violence, a sort of form of indirect signaling, was always bound up with a real world particularist kind of Anglo-American experience of how they saw terrorism. And the entire idea really of many of the kind of flagship campaigns of the war on terror, particularly the invasion of Afghanistan, which has been on our minds so much, of course, in recent weeks with the American withdrawal, is that the way to fight terrorism for the homeland, so to speak, was to go over there being places like Afghanistan, and keeping it at one remove. A curiously sort of 20th century and compartmentalized way of seeing the world, but one that also in strange ways conflated, arguably, a lot of different phenomena. whatever one thinks of the Taliban Al-Qaeda alliance and relationship, which is very complex and murky, I think, and attracted a lot of attention of late as to how it might develop. There clearly is an alliance, a very long-standing there, but there's also often, I think it's fair to say, quite divergent interests. And, as a very crude sketch, one could see the Taliban, or much of the Taliban, as often moved by something like a nationalist agenda, and Al-Qaeda being more global in their horizons. There is overlap, but there is also profound divergence. And arguably one of the things that the global war on terror did was conflate those categories. I think one of the things that President Biden has tried to do is unpick that, to see Afghanistan as an anti-terrorist or counter-terrorist mission that had run its course. I don't think in the very long run that's necessarily the worst analysis. I think if I say, one of the lessons of the war on terror is these kind of feedback loops that often it's actually sort of zones of conflict far away from the West that have tended to spark off these kind of spin-off, often quite small or amateur attacks. But there's clearly are global feedback loops that are profound and embedded and clearly energized by those ongoing campaigns. So I'm a little bit schizophrenic on that. I think in many ways, ending the Afghan war was not the worst of decisions. The way it was done, however, and the images it has created are really, truly rather extraordinary. And I think it is worth stressing that in the globalized network society that's grown up in this century, the optics in the images do matter, and this will be claimed unambiguously as a victory for Islamist extremists of various sorts. And I think that's already happened and will happen. Now, how that then plays out, because I'm deeply conscious that I haven't talked much about the future despite the invitation, how that will pan out, I think, is really anyone's guess. I think some of the predictions that somehow we're in a kind of Groundhog Day feedback loop where, well, the Al-Qaeda were embedded with the Taliban, now the Taliban are back in power 20 years later, watch out for another 9/11. I think the contingent circumstances of 9/11 were so extraordinary, and the way that the surprise that was pulled off on that day, it is hard. I mean, it's not impossible, but it is hard to imagine a kind of surprise of similar scale happening in the near future. But that's not to say that the victory there won't be taken as inspiration by other groups of like-minded or convergent agendas. So I think the narrative will matter, and I think narratives and culture do matter more and more in a social media and networked age. So I think that really that victory has put a kind of jolt of energy, as some have said, through the global jihadist movement. In terms of how that, say, works out on the streets of Western cities, I suppose I will risk two predictions, because although I'm a historian and I don't like to talk about the future, I feel obliged to sort of stick my neck out and take some risks. So I think, I think we will continue to see an acceleration of the trends of the last few years, which is towards a sort of diffusion of terrorism. A lot of the attacks that have happened, there have been spectaculars, the Manchester attack and so on. But a lot of it actually hasn't been nearly as spectacular as one might have expected. It's been much more amateur and diffuse, and it's tended not to be so much on what I think of as global prestige stages. Not the centre of London, not the Houses of Parliament, not Heathrow Airport, but more smaller towns and parks and places one wouldn't necessarily expect. And I think the ways in which the communications revolution and camera phones and so on have themselves diffused incentivizes that much more amateur and sometimes low-tech primitive attack forms in counterintuitive ways, and expect to see more of that. Arguably one of the things that ISIS did do was popularize this idea of the self-starter attacks. It was a very old idea. It's what the Communist International was talking about in the 1940s under in the Nazi occupations. It's what Al-Qaeda tried to do, but they actually, to a certain extent, did actually generate the enthusiasm and momentum for that to happen. I think also worrying then is the counter reactions, the rise of the far right and sort of nativist, racist, Islamophobic counter movements, which are a real threat to social cohesion. And we just, I guess I can't say too much about what I think may still be an ongoing court case, but the recent trial of, by all accounts, a pretty amateur attempt to kind of threaten the mosque was it Glenrothes? I think it was somewhere in Fife. It looks like it's a symptom of that wider phenomenon. So I think that is something to worry about. And I'd also just say that yes, I mean, clearly the proliferation of drones and that kind of technology and AI is clearly worrying. It's often the threats are more amateur than we might think. It's less the absolute high-tech end and more just flying a drone around Gatwick Airport a couple of years back caused absolute mayhem. It wasn't a terrorist attack, but you could see how these things could be weaponized by actors with malign intent. So, I mean, I think to sum all that up, and I've ranged in a wide-eyed and wide-angle fashion over much of the globe and not just Asia at all, but, I think the basic takeaway is that the threat landscape continues to get more complicated. Having said that, in the sort of 10 years or so I've been studying terrorism, I'm yet to go to any conference, seminar, presentation, or government get together where experts didn't say the threat landscape's getting more complicated. So that's probably time for me to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, for a great introduction, as I said, to a complex subject and a pretty impossible, well, not an impossible question to answer, the future of terrorism, but you have answered it. The threat landscape is increasingly complex. So that's the simple answer. Perhaps we cut across to Noah, obviously. Noah, so first of all, I apologize for, I'm not trying to caricature all Americans with a quote from George Bush at the start, because in the 2000s, during those years of, I think many of us are calling the Al-Qaeda years, I was traveling around the world a lot, and everywhere I visited, some quite difficult places at times, the place I always went to visit was the US Embassy or US Consulate to talk to the regional security officer, the RSO in State Department. So Americans are everywhere, and they have a great deal of insight into the places where they are. And so we're glad you're here at St. Andrews to help us with that insight. Maybe if you can start from Central Asia, because that's where you spend a lot of time, obviously, but how do you see things developing from that region in light of what's happened recently?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me today. And I should apologize. First of all, see, I'm learning to adapt to British culture a little bit. So I understand I should probably always start with apologies. First of all, I won't undertake the kind of ambition that Tim has and well deserves to speak about how things may affect terrorism broadly or in the whole world, aside from what I can say about Central Asian actors and how they may affect issues beyond the region themselves in a way that will be clear, I guess, in a moment. But then also that I also am very loath to attempt to predict the future too much. So what I will try to do, though, is to draw on the recent history of events in Central Asia that do feel sometimes like a bit of a Groundhog Day, particularly with the resurgence of the Taliban just across the border. And try to draw some questions that we might be able to take from recent history to help us understand what may happen next. And I'll talk a little bit about some brief scenarios that I see potentially developing and the possibilities for each of them, although I think I'll leave most of that to the question time. So the problem set for all of this in Central Asia, as I see it today, or particularly as it's being discussed more widely, whether it's in the media or among experts or within the regions, is that not only do we have this long history of Afghanistan as a neighbor and the very long civil war in Afghanistan and the Soviet involvement in the conflict in Afghanistan, beginning already before my lifetime. But within the last 10 years, we have thousands. There's a great deal of disagreement about numbers, but perhaps as many as 12,000 people from Central Asia who traveled to the Syrian conflict and created Central Asian-led battalions within both HTS or Jabhat al-Nusra in the beginning and ISIS. And then we also have what may be a separate phenomenon, that individual Central Asian migrants inspired by ISIS primarily participated in multiple what we might call classic terror attacks, or as Tim referred to, self-starter terrorist attacks in the West. So we have both in Europe, Turkey, and the United States, particularly carried out by ethnic Uzbeks who are affiliated with ISIS or who claimed an affiliation with ISIS. And this came to reinforce a long-standing idea, whether or not it's a stereotype or an idea we can discuss further, that Central Asia has a terrorism problem that affects Central Asia and the rest of the world. Central Asian involvement in international jihadist organizations began in the 1990s in Afghanistan. So we are in a lot of ways returning back to the beginning with the formation of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan in an alliance with both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. It was founded by an ideologue and a commander, two separate people who served in the Afghan-Soviet War and in the Tajik Civil War. Central Asian militants, especially Uzbeks, like Chechens, their famous counterparts from the former Soviet Union, became legendary as fierce fighters in the Afghan conflict, particularly in Western reporting, in part triggered by the classic book, The Taliban by Ahmed Rashid, and were taken as signals of the internationalization of the conflict and its potential to spill out of Afghanistan into its neighboring states or elsewhere. If Central Asian militant Islamism was born in the conflict in Afghanistan, and in some cases grew as a violent response to the same political leaders who are still in power today in Central Asia, doesn't a Taliban victory spell a repeat of either the 1990s or the 2010s? So this outflow, perhaps, or resurgence of militant groups inside Afghanistan being given cover by the other organizations, or a mass, almost population movement to a foreign conflict like what happened in Syria. I don't think we can answer these questions yet, unfortunately, especially not in 10 minutes. And if I were to claim that I could confidently predict the future of such a massively complex issue in 10 minutes or at all, you should probably stop listening to me. But we can focus on what questions to ask, how to ask those questions, and maybe sketch out some potential scenarios. So first, I suggest that we need to reframe the entire question of the scenario that I raised right at the beginning. According to Handa Centre reporting, which produced sort of the last large numerical count of foreign fighters who participated in the Syrian conflict, more people traveled to Syria as what we called, at least at that time, foreign fighters from the former USSR than any other region of the world, including the Middle East and North Africa, which is really quite stunning. And it doesn't seem like it should be right, but there are many of us who have checked it as many ways as we can. And we can't say, of course, all of these things are estimate. We can't list it as a fact, you know, that we have hard numbers. But they certainly indicate that far more people came from the former Soviet Union than we would have expected, than we had ever expected in a conflict like that before. And the other thing we find as we get closer into those numbers, even within the Handa Centre report, is that many more people tried to go than actually succeeded or were recorded as succeeding. So they have numbers, for example, from the Turkish border services of people who were stopped, citizens of Kazakhstan, and I believe they have a count for citizens of Tajikistan who were stopped and apprehended at the border attempting to cross into Syria. And when you add those numbers to the ones that we already know, we get really quite high numbers, perhaps as high as 12 or 16,000 even. But if we look deeper, as I've argued in a piece that is forthcoming for Klingendahl, we can't refer to many of these people as foreign fighters. Most of them, in the case of Kazakhstan, by a ratio we know of 5 to 1, were women and children. And very often, in some cases in Central Asia, these are multi-generational families, sometimes including the very elderly and infants. These were people seeking something different. They were seeking a new life they believed was waiting for them in the caliphate or a territory controlled by Islamist groups, or were seeking to support the Syrian people they believed were suffering. As one interview that I conducted a couple of years ago, a woman described it as suffering worse than we were, even under our tyrannical government. So an elderly grandmother who left her husband to bring her family and her grandchildren from a rural village in northern Kyrgyzstan to live in the caliphate has little to nothing in common with Juman Amangani, the Soviet soldier and battlefield commander in the Tajik Civil War who helped found the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. Similarly, little children that I met in Kazakhstan, where I was last week, helping in a review for the US State Department of their returnee program, children who are repatriated from Syria and don't even understand that they were there, have little in common with Saifullah Saipov, the Uzbek citizen and long-distance truck driver in the United States who murdered 8 people in New York City in 2017, believing that he was striking a blow against the United States on behalf of oppressed Muslims, much along the lines of the Bin Laden quote that you began with. And neither of these scenarios have much in common with the 2 worst attacks to happen within Central Asia in recent years: an attempted uprising in Aktobe, a desert city in western Kazakhstan, when a group of young men attempted to attack a military munitions depot, and a former convict in Almaty who later that summer in 2016 shot and killed police officers while attempting to attack a court building after murdering a prostitute and knowing he was about to be rearrested and go back to prison. Yet all of these things are lumped into the definition of terrorism, which suggests that we may need to do some important disaggregation in order to understand what might wait for us in the future. And we're told that there's more of a threat of terrorism because of events in Afghanistan. But what does this mean to these very different categories of things? So I want to argue, before outlining any scenarios, that we may in fact have 2 very different problems, or potentially very different problems. We have angry and disaffected people who believe they need to seek a violent solution to political grievances, often attacking representatives of their government and security forces in these very long-term consolidated authoritarian states, which is something maybe closer to revolution than what we think of as jihadist terrorism aimed against the United States or other global powers. And then secondly, we have a mass migration of people who very mistakenly believe that there's a better life waiting for them in another country's civil war. These are both problems, and both are legitimate security issues, one of physical security of the public and the state, and one of human security, and they may bleed over into one another. So if we think about disaggregating these 2 problems, I think we see sort of 4 potential scenarios that may happen in Central Asia over the next couple of years, and they apply to different angles of this problem. The first one that I'm sort of most curious about is the question of whether there is really any potential for a kind of mass migration of foreign fighters and conflict migrants to uproot themselves from Central Asia into Afghanistan and the Taliban in the same way they did into Syria. On one hand, it's much closer. It's right across the border from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Many parts of the border in Tajikistan are notoriously porous. There's smuggling, particularly drug smuggling operations that are rampant in both of those areas. It's not all that difficult for people to pay off a smuggler to also hide them along with the shipment of heroin or money into the back of a truck. So theoretically, it should be quite a bit easier even than it was in the 1990s, when the northern portions of the country were controlled by the Northern Alliance, for Central Asians to make some sort of mass migration into Afghanistan in the same way they did into Syria. But there's a question for me in particular, having spent most of the last 8 years, I guess, of my life working on the Central Asian mobilization to Syria, with whether war fatigue and a lack of appeal result maybe in no significant conflict migration in the near term. There may be a finite number of people who are responsive to these narratives and who are interested in taking their grandchildren to go and live in a putative caliphate somewhere else. Many of these people now know, many people in potentially the same situation as others, their neighbors who left maybe for Syria in 2012 or 2013, many of those people understand the conflict in Afghanistan in a different way than they did the conflict in Syria, and also may benefit from hearing about the experiences of the often uniformly extremely negative and destructive experiences of neighbors who did go to fight in Syria, many of whom lost family members and lost their children in the case that they survived. And then there's another question really about whether or not the Afghan conflict can ever have the same sort of draw that the Syrian conflict did, in particular because of this question of suffering people this is how it was portrayed in much of the recruiting messaging, suffering innocent people, brother and sister Muslims who were being oppressed, who were having suffering under biological and chemical attacks from an Assad regime. This was one of the particularly resonant narratives that drew Central Asians into that conflict. And we don't really have that anymore in Afghanistan. We have a very different set of narratives about a triumphant Islamic emirate, and about sort of fighting off the last militants who oppose them, who are also in this case claiming the right to fight for a caliphate and establish Islamic rule. So there are, in this first scenario, it is essentially that there won't be parity between these two things, and I lean towards that one probably being the most likely if I were pressed to make a guess, as I guess I am. The second potential scenario,
just to maybe could we cut back to Central Asia shortly?
Sure, sure.
We need a lot longer today, I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
But you've given a couple of the scenarios that I think are pretty compelling, especially in relation to Syria. But we can come back to that. I just want to make sure we have time for
yes.
Zhang Ce. We're particularly grateful to you because when we talk about Asia, it's most useful to hear from people from Asia rather than those of us who are not from Asia. So really would most like to have your insight into the perspective from China, especially near Noah's region, which I think is the segue into that.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Martin, for putting this together. It's really an honor to be on the same panel with him and Noah. And I find myself agreeing a lot of what Noah has said, especially related to the definition of foreign terrorist fighters. So in my research, I did a lot of things that confirms the observation of the need to really investigate the definition of that. So I will talk about the perspective from China today. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this comment immediately after the US withdrawal that China must be very happy that the US is leaving and it's now happily stepping in and project its power in this region. I'm sure by now a lot of people have already rejected this idea of being too simplistic, but I will provide more empirical evidence to show that why this is not the case. So security risk is obviously remains to be a major cause of concern for any China's involvement in the region. Just early in July this year, there was a terrorist attack in Pakistan which killed 13 people, including 9 Chinese. This event was not really widely reported in China, obviously, because it hurts China's legitimacy in terms of its Chinese citizens dying outside its borders. And after some investigation, Pakistan and China both reported that this event could potentially be emboldened by what happened in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And the investigation also said that this event was conducted by Turkestan Islamic Party, which is also known as the East Turkestan Islamic Party, which is, I will use the abbreviation ATIM in the remainder of this session. So it conducted by both ATIM and also the Pakistani Taliban, so which just confirms the belief that China is very concerned about the affinity of two Talibans, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, especially because of the 1,400 miles unguarded border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And adding to that, there was another more remote terrorist attack in 2016, targeting Chinese embassy at Bishkek. So the attack was also reported to be conducted by a Uyghur, a member of the ATIM. I will talk about the definition of atom in a bit. So obviously this really put China's legitimacy in test, and also it is difficult for China to incentivize its companies to make any further investment in Afghanistan, because we know that China's investment in Belt and Road countries are not or necessarily all conducted by the state. A lot of them was conducted by individual companies. Another speculation around China's next move is that China is also looking to diversify its investment, which has already been observed in some countries in Central Asia. So China is trying to shift away from infrastructure development to manufacturing, which is, I think, consistent with China's domestic goal towards low carbon economy. And also the economic downturn during the COVID obviously has been a reason that is motivating China to rethink its strategy to pour resources into Belt and Road countries as it did before. But that being said, China has been and can do something in the region. So for example, even during the COVID into the 2020, China's investment in Afghanistan has increased by 11%. And also China and Pakistan were the first to respond immediately after the US left the country. Obviously, some of the it is partly because China and Pakistan are very close to Afghanistan, which means that they are more vulnerable to the spillover of any kinds of violence in Afghanistan. So within 1 week of the US withdrawal, China has pledged 31 million of emergency aid, including food and water supplies, as well as vaccines of COVID. Another regional framework that China could use is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it in 2017 it included both India and Pakistan into its membership into the group. So which allow China and Russia to have more leverage to address any instability in the region. And another guess is that China could also include Afghanistan in the CPEC, which is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which started at a value of 47 billion, which is now increased to 62 billion. So that would allow a lot of the infrastructure project to go in. And another point I would like to make is again related to definition, which I think Tim and Noah has already said a lot about. So the definition problem manifested in China is, I think a lot of the problem is caused by a simple question of translation. So there's always a lot of confusion about the two phrases. One is East Turkestan Forces, and the other is East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is a designated terrorist group. Obviously, there has been some debate within the US regarding whether this atom still exists. And I think recently US has taken the group out from the terrorist blacklist. But the former, the East Turkestan Forces, we often hear this phrase from Chinese official media to refer to any people, any individuals or organizations associated with the cause of independence, whether through peaceful advocacy or violent ways. The definition itself is obviously problematic, which I have explained in one of my papers. I will put the link of that paper in the chat box later. But the problem is when it's referring to East Turkestan Forces, it's not necessarily saying that these people have been trialed and it is a legal judgment after being proved that these people have actual affiliation with the actual organization. So it becomes very clear that in those countries mentioned in Pakistan and Afghanistan, there might be a lot of people who are share the similar goals of the independence of what they call East Turkestan. They don't necessarily label themselves as ATIM, as a member of ATIM. I think this is quite understandable, because if I were a terrorist, I wouldn't say that I belong to this terrorist group if I know that saying so would mean that my assets will be frozen. So then that leads to another question, another problem, which is there's a very difficult balance to strike here between the narrow and wider version of terrorism. If the definition is too narrow, the risk is China wouldn't be able to effectively bar real terrorists away from its borders. But if the if the definition is too wide, well, we have all seen what happens in Xinjiang, where the situation has resulted in a cascade of criticism and sanctions from major Western countries. So to summarize, the first point is China is not necessarily happy with the situation in Afghanistan, and it's very obviously still very concerned about making the next move in the region. And the second point, any cooperation is likely to be conducted through regional frameworks such as SCO and CPEC. And thirdly, obviously going back to the definitional problem, the biggest challenge is to have a workable and actionable definition that is shared by both China and Afghanistan, as well as how much Afghanistan government is really able to control over these individual sporadic lone wolf style terrorists. So with that, I'll hand over back to Martin.
Thank you very much, Zhang Jie. Before I go back to Tim, because we want to bring in some of the questions from the audience, some very good ones, I just have a quick follow-up question for you. And when I was studying Cruz St. Andrews a few years ago, one of the things I wrote about was piracy in South China Seas especially, and the surrounding seas, but also piracy on the Mekong River. And I think, as you know, the People's Armed Police have deployed on the Mekong River outside of the borders of the People's Republic of China for some years. And that was because of a huge problem of piracy on the Mekong. And that was with the cooperation of other countries through which the Mekong flows. So I think we've seen that extraterritoriality from the People's Republic of China for some years in relation to that particular threat, which is piracy. What do you think is the likelihood of extraterritorial action in relation to counterterrorism by the authorities from the People's Republic of China, especially in that area we've just talked about from you and Noah, Central Asia around Afghanistan?
Thank you. I think there has been already some actions, bilateral or regional actions made in this regard of terrorist cooperation, for example, through SCO. And also China has, I don't know particularly about that region that you are talking about, but I know that China and Kazakhstan have some agreement to extradite Uyghur separatists, which also obviously resulted a lot of resentment within Kazakhstan, and I think which also resulted in several protests against a protest at the Chinese embassy in Kazakhstan. So I think there has already been mechanism in place, but I don't think will be immediately a new change in that trend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a quick answer to a big subject. Tim, want to cut back to you if we could, because we have a couple of very interesting questions. And excuse me if I'd like to put two together. Firstly, from Satria Santoso, who has said, and I'll make the question shorter, how do you see the role of drones in the future of terrorism? Do you see a shift from visible enemies to unseen individuals that can give threats to society in the future? And there's a follow-up question to Satrio's question from Jonathan Ritchie. How do we expect expanding technological and cyber capabilities to influence the future of terrorism? Sorry, rather broad questions, but you touched on drones earlier in your introduction. I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit more in relation to those questions.
Thanks, and thanks for the sharp questions. Yes, I mean, I think drones are a problem. Anyone I've talked to who has any kind of responsibility in this field seems pretty worried about them for good reason. I mean, I think the diffusion of this technology and the degree of sort of command and control and systems integration it gives individuals or small groups is pretty unprecedented. And the great go-to book on this is Audrey Cronin's Power to the People, that came out just over a year ago, in which she looks at sort of moments of open innovation in which new technologies are then taken on by sort of entrepreneurs and sort of garden shared hobbyists, and sometimes repurposed and used in ways that we can't predict. And she has a sort of wonderful backwards look at that happening to dynamite in the late 19th century, and then uses it to look forward into the future to suggest we might be living through a kind of similar age of globalization of emergent technologies. So I think it is something to worry about. I mean, a couple of or three very brief examples: Houthi oil refinery attack, 14th September 2019. The rebels there from Yemen seem to be using Iranian made kit, or that was the allegation. But I mean, they temporarily at least cut Saudi oil production in half. That was pretty dramatic. The apparent, and I say apparent because it's very, very murky in terms of, you know, who did it and whether it will, what their purpose was, but the apparent assassination attempt on President Maduro of Venezuela, 4th of August 2018, a pretty small explosion, and that's where some of the question marks then come over as to whether it was what it seemed to be or whether it was some false flag provocation. But I mean, it showed what could be done. And then, you know, some really quite ambitious stuff. There was a sort of the Tajik Islamic State in Germany of last year, April 2020, where, I mean, it was a plot that was disrupted, but they seemed to be planning to do something with chemical weapons and or some sort of drone delivery. So, you know, that I think it is a real and emergent threat, and a very predictable one that we need to be on top of. Cyber is more, a little bit more murky. I mean, things could change if expertise becomes more diffuse. But so far, I've tended to see kind of cyber sabotage as actually more like real world sabotage than we tend to think. In other words, to really understand how to do it effectively, you probably need to think like a state and probably be a state. So that may change, but at the moment, the real threats, I think, have come from state actors rather than non-state actors.
Thanks, Tim. That was it was two separate areas together, as you quite rightly pointed out. But I guess they both have the same outcome, which is, and you touched on as well, when attacks can be false flags, and actually identifying the origin and perpetrators at times, it seems to be increasingly difficult in the future. I'm sorry I don't have a segue back to this, Noah, but I want to try and bring in questions from the audience, because that's what we do. We want to give people this chance. And I think there's an interesting question from Anonymous. Do you think there's a relationship between Central Asian support of Islamic terrorism today and the past of these Central Asian countries under a communist, atheistic government? Again, a big question, but I think from your experience in Central Asia, you could say something about this.
Thanks, and thank you for the question, whoever sent it, to Anonymous, I guess. It's a really big question, and it's one that I don't think we have any set answer for. I mean, there are people who argue from many different perspectives. There are many Central Asians themselves who feel that their real Islamic identity, or their freedom to fully practice their religion, may have been denied them in the years of you know, what many sort of, you know, nationalists now may look at as a Soviet occupation during the period of the Soviet Union, rather than a constituent membership in the Soviet Union. There's a real mix between these kind of nationalist and anti-colonial narratives and the self-justifying politics that the regimes that exist today, the administrations that exist today, and that justified themselves in the 1990s, took on to justify why they should get to be an independent state rather than part of something else, and why that independent state should be run by someone who often titles themselves the father of the nation in one way or the other. And one of those identities that comes particularly from young people who didn't live through this era themselves is this idea that they were denied a chance to be part of a broader universal Muslim identity that they see themselves in. Interestingly, the experiences of people who lived through the Soviet period themselves are often different and a lot more complicated. There's a lot of great work that's been done on what life for Muslims was actually like in the Soviet Union by people like my friend Aaron Tassar, who's a historian at Duke, I think now. But I think it's unmistakable that one of the messages that's used by both very successfully by both recruiting organizations and that some of those audiences that are receptive to this, one of their primary narratives is this idea that both in the Soviet period and as a result of the legacy of Soviet policies, Central Asian Muslims are denied the right to fully practice their religion and make their religion the primary part of their identity. So it's a thorny issue that there's a lot of social disagreement about within Central Asia, but certainly narratives along those lines and highlighting those grievances have been used pretty successfully in the recruitment process.
Thank you very much. We're coming up to an hour, and it's been a pretty quick hour, but I'd like to I think to ask a difficult question, if I could, as a closing one, and put it to all three of you. And perhaps we'll sort of go backwards, maybe Zhang Xi and then Noah and then Tim as the director to sort of round it out. But I guess my final question would be, is the study of terrorism helping government policymakers and others in society to better understand it, or not? I'm not putting this as are you doing well or not. Are government policymakers and others in society better understanding terrorism at the point we're at now? Because, as I said, I also find it a most complex issue. And when we look at the differences between a set of twin towers in New York being attacked with jets and a member of parliament in the UK being attacked with a knife, a police officer in Hong Kong being attacked with a knife by a person who then stabs himself in the heart. These are complex matters, but all very different. So from your perspective, both from China, from Central Asia, US, and then lastly, Tim, how do you see the understanding of terrorism now? Is it as well understood now? Is it better understood now than it was 20, 30 years ago? Zhang Xi, especially from China, first of all.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's a really good one. So from China's perspective, usually people would have the impression that in China, any kinds of criticism are likely to be silenced before they can reach any element in the government. But that is not necessarily the case. Within the academia, we sometimes see that criticisms against some of the government policies are framed very carefully, but the criticism are there. And I would suppose that those happened in published academic papers. But I suppose within the government, because there are a lot of internal reports written for the government, but not necessarily for the public. I think there is increasingly the understanding that the overly broad definition of terrorism is causing some problems, and the government is trying to learn from the experience of other countries that what kind of disastrous result would come from a overly broad definition. But I have to say that this is changing government's attitude very slowly, because we all know that the government does not necessarily very readily tolerant of any criticism against its policies. So it's making a change, but in a very slow pace, I would say. Thank you.
Noah, over to you.
Thank you. This is a really difficult question. I don't think I'll be able to answer it as well as my colleagues, but I mean, I guess I would say I have probably two perspectives on this. One is our understanding and constantly improving understanding in academia of what the causes and the factors that we should consider in understanding terrorism, even the really fascinating conversation that we've had today about disaggregating different portions of it, I think are immensely useful and help us achieve not just more granularity, as policymakers like to say, but get a better understanding of what's actually happening. I think within the region that I work on mostly in Central Asia, the understanding of terrorism and the classification of all of these different phenomena as a sort of a unitary broad brush as terrorism has been less helpful. And in particular, because terrorism, as it's understood there, is understood as Islamist militancy, and Islamist militancy is understood not as a politics but as religion, essentially as a case of religious fanaticism, that people catch a virus of sort of Salafism that comes from external areas, and then what has to be done in order to prevent terrorism is just prevent people from catching this virus, somehow, or treat the people who have caught it already. But I think one of the things that we can bring to that from benefit of research and from many of our own mistakes, maybe if we're reflexive about this in academy, is that there's a lot more to this than just people's religious beliefs or how they pray or which rituals they perform. There are in all of these things a politics, and I think that might be something that the study of terrorism can offer to it when it meets policy.
Thank you very much, Noah. Tim, we've run over a bit, but there are 90 people still waiting to hear your closing comments.
Pressure. It's an excellent question. Walter Laqueur, who's one of the kind of founding fathers, along with the sort of Paul Wilkinson generation in the 70s, writing about terrorism, made a plea for using terror in the plural, terrorisms, and it never really caught on, but it might be worth revisiting, because I think, as my esteemed colleagues have said, I mean, context is all, and that has actually been part of the challenge of terrorism studies as a sort of academic field. Is, yes, to a certain extent, I think in reaction to awful world events, we have established credentials that this is a serious thing that needs to be taken seriously. I'm not sure we've quite got to the next stage of a more subtle understanding that there are family resemblances. It's worth looking at different contexts, and sometimes one sees a lot of similarities and patterns and overt connections or resemblances, but context is always important, and to a certain extent idiosyncratic. In terms of the UK, I think public attitudes, and to a certain extent government, I think, does reflect public attitudes quite faithfully, actually. I think they're very complex and nuanced. I think at one level, there is actually quite a lot of common sense. I mean, everyone who commutes into central Edinburgh or central London kind of takes a risk every day, and they know that they do because you're reminded all the time. So there's a kind of basic kind of common sense of, yeah, the threat's there, but we'll just get on with it. But if you actually articulate that, if you actually stand on a political platform and say, well, really the answer to terrorism is to accept a degree of risk, and occasionally horrendous things are going to happen, and MPs are going to be knifed in their constituencies in horrendous ways. But actually the alternative is a police state. What do you want? Which is, I think really what it boils down to. I mean, just nobody dares say that. I mean, so there's a sort of lot of doublethink, I think, going on. To a certain extent, I think there is a lot of proportion, actually, when one looks at the kind of level of mass behavior and how people actually navigate their lives, and to a certain extent government takes that on board. I think one of the worrying trends of recent years has been the sort of effect of whatever the opposite of education is, diseducation of social media. I mean, the way in which it is legitimized and turbo-powered the crudest and most prejudiced understandings of how these processes work, and of how atypical individuals can be taken as somehow representative of a whole community or ethnic group or religion or whatever it is, and then leading to counter reactions, has been really worrying. I do think we are finally getting a bit of pushback of holding behemoths like Facebook to account. It's long overdue. So I'm not pessimistic, but it's a fight for understanding that one has to keep renewing, which is essentially, this is part of the modern condition, which goes full circle to what I said at the beginning of understanding it as a kind of foreign problem that comes and invades our nice, peaceful societies isn't the way to start. The world's too interconnected for that.
Brilliant closing. Thank you very much, and thank you, Noah, for your insight, especially into Central Asia, and Zhangzi, especially for your insight into China from a Chinese perspective. I think which is particularly useful. I think for everyone, in one short hour, that's as good an insight into the nature of terrorism, especially in relation to Asia, as we could possibly get. You can get a great deal more insight by signing up for the MLIT or the certificate or other courses from the Handa Centre, the study of terrorism and political violence at the University of St Andrews, which I would highly recommend. I'm very grateful to all three of you for your time and your comments, and I hope we'll be seeing each other soon. As Noah said in an earlier written correspondence, hopefully for a drink in person and not just by video. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Martin. And I didn't ask you to say that. That's very generous. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening and for the sharp questions.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you.
See you next week. Bye-bye.